Welcome back. See if my voice holds out for round 3 here. In this last talk, my title is something like Human Capital, Marriage, and Divorce from an Austrian Perspective. That's my only slide for this talk. You're looking at it. So I'm going to do this sort of the old-fashioned way. This one I have kind of written out more than the other two because this one's a little more complicated and dense in places. And it turns out I think the order we did these today worked out just right, not just because now after 2 I'm a little tired so I can just kind of read this one. But I think that this one draws on things that we've talked about in the first 2, that I talked about in the first 2 talks today in some ways that I think are interesting and productive. So, and I should note, this is, as I said, essentially one of the chapters in the book project. The original paper this is based on was co-authored with my colleague and friend Peter Lewin. I mentioned Peter because Peter is very envious of my being in Lithuania. 3 of his 4 grandparents were born in Lithuania, so I'm trying to convince these guys to invite him out here sometime so he can come and come home, as it were. Yeah, with grandparents. Yeah, I know. Actually, what's interesting is he was born in South Africa. So he was born in South Africa, and now Peter lives in. He'd love me talking about this. Peter lives in Dallas, Texas, and he's the only person from Texas I know with a South African accent still after 30 years. You keep waiting for that Texas accent, but it's South Africa still. So. Okay, so what I want to do in this talk and what this chapter, what the original paper does, is to look at these questions of marriage and divorce from an Austrian perspective. And I guess a couple of things to contextualize this. One interesting sort of puzzle that people, not just economists, but sociologists and others have tried to explain is something like the following. Economic theory would say that for the period of time in which men were earning greater incomes than women, substantially greater incomes, it wasn't surprising that women took on most of the responsibilities in the household. I mean, the simple model that economists would use is talk about the opportunity cost of people's time, right? If the wage the man can earn is higher than the wage women can earn, it doesn't make much sense for the man to be the one working at home because the opportunity cost of doing that, he's giving up more that he could earn in the market than the woman doing, taking care of production in the house would be. And so if that was true at one time, suppose we imagine the future, suppose we were in the 1960s or 70s, imagining the future in which men's and women's wages were much more closer to equal. In fact, today, men's and women's wages, when we hold things and all the right things constant, are fairly close to equal. We would predict, based on that, what? We would predict that men and women share household responsibilities equally. Because if the opportunity cost of their time at home was more equal, it should be the case that more, that household production, taking care of the kids and cleaning the house and so on, would be close to equally divided as well. But it turns out empirically that while the distribution of time that the housework is done between men and women is more equal than it used to be, that is, men do relatively more work than they used to, it's still far from equal. Right? Women still do the clear majority of work around the house, even though it's more equal. Interesting, by the way, both men and women devote less time to household production than they did in the past. But women have devoted substantially less time, men a little bit less, and they've equaled out. And from an economic perspective, there's a puzzle there. If their wages have become pretty much close to equal, why haven't their contributions to the household become pretty much equal? Something else must be going on to explain why it's still predominantly women's work, right? What sociologists call the second shift, that is household production, is still disproportionately women's work. And that's one of the things that motivated our thinking in this chapter and in this talk that I want to give. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go. And what we tried to do here is to show how the Austrian approach to thinking about disequilibrium, to thinking about plan formation under uncertainty, and to think how Austrians might think about human capital, that all those can be combined to illuminate a number of interesting things, historical changes, empirical puzzles surrounding modern marriage and divorce. So that's the overarching theme here. So let me start. One of the features of modern Austrian economics is that Austrians have attempted to incorporate and account for what we might call endogenous change. Some of the best work in the last 40 years in Austrian economics has explored the effect that social and economic institutions have on the patterns of economic outcomes we observe and the ways in which those institutions continue to change. So what we're interested in is how institutions affect outcomes and how those institutions themselves change. As distinct from neoclassical mainstream economics, which Austrians share much with, recent work in Austrian economics has given special attention to decision-making under conditions of real-world uncertainty, what we call radical, genuine uncertainty. The uncertainty where you don't know what it is you don't know, right? There's a difference between not knowing what you don't know and knowing you don't know something. Now, I know it's still early in the day for that, right? But if I don't know what the capital of Latvia is, but I know that I don't know it, I can go look it up, right? Cell phone's over there. I can go Google it, right? Find out the capital. That's something I know that I don't know. But there are things that I don't know that I don't know. I can't tell you what they are, because then I would know that I don't know them. All right? And so Austrians are particularly concerned with that kind of radical uncertainty, where people don't know what they don't know, and how social and economic institutions, like the market, help us learn, help us discover things that we didn't know. And we start with individuals who form expectations in particular institutional environments, and those expectations are formed by their own knowledge. And Austrian approaches recognize that our expectations and the plans and the valuations to which they lead may differ among individuals. And this can give rise to what we call, and I talked about in the Piketty lecture, plan disequilibrium. That my plan and your plan are not compatible. Both of us can't be right. The market process approach associated with Austrian economics allows for this kind of imperfect information and structural uncertainty and disequilibrium outcomes. Right? And it's that perspective that's going to inform this analysis of marriage and divorce. So let's start with the relationship, sort of the economics of the family. We talked a little bit about this in the last lecture, but traditionally, economics distinguishes between households and firms. The household economics that's been developed in the last several decades, though, one way of interpreting that is that the household is merely a special type of small firm. And there are important similarities between firms and households. But the problem with thinking of households as firms is it can obscure the distinct characteristics of households and the role that households play in the broader society. Households, families, produce goods and services for their own consumption, not for the market. Right? The meals that we cook in the house, the children we raise in the house we don't sell those in the market. Those are for us. This is a defining characteristic, and it's what distinguishes households from firms. Firms are organizations that specialize in production for the market. Households don't. They used to, as we talked about, but not anymore. But like the firm, the family is an organization, the household is an organization that engages in joint production. Family members combine their resources and their efforts to produce outcomes that they value. The most obvious, of course, is children, but love, companionship, a clean house, insurance, nutrition, education, training, all the various types of human capital, all of these things, these fruits of family production depend, as with production in general, on the scope for the division of labor. In general, the more specialized family members are, and more importantly, the more specialized they become over time, the greater rewards to household production in comparison to alternatives, right? In this way, greater advantage can be taken of differences in any natural or acquired comparative advantage between family members. The degree of specialization of family members, specifically of husbands and wives, has dramatically decreased, as we talked about in the last lecture. On one side, women have entered the workforce in larger numbers, and that's reduced the advantages of specializing in the man as the bread earner and the woman taking care of the household. On the other side, as we talked about in the last lecture, substitutes for household production have become more numerous and affordable. That reduces the advantage of having a specialized person, usually the woman, responsible for household production. So the benefits of producing certain goods within the household as opposed to the market have been declining. And notice this is self-reinforcing. As families become increasingly, as families benefit more from having two incomes, they can afford to purchase market substitutes for household production. Right? And as people are working more, that's made the supply of those substitutes more widely available and more affordable. Right? So as people get richer, they can buy more things from them. They want to buy more things in the market to substitute for working at home, and the very fact that they're working makes it possible for them to do that. One of the ironies of this trend is that a fair number of women entering the labor force now are engaging in kinds of labor like teaching, healthcare, personal services that are quite similar to what their mothers or grandmothers might have performed, except women today are performing those tasks in the market and getting paid for them rather than applying them directly to household production. So the woman who goes into the workforce to work at a daycare center is doing more or less what she would have done maybe a generation ago in her own home, except getting paid to do it for someone else, right? Which is an interesting irony. One of the other things we note is that marriage is occurring later, and the incidence of marriage has declined at all ages. The median age for first marriage for men in the United States has risen from 23, right after World War II, to about 27 or 28 today. For women, it was age 20 after World War II. Today, it's about 26. Those figures, the recent figures, represent a later age than even the relatively high ages of first marriage we saw in the late 19th century, but this is not a particular modern phenomenon. Likewise, and again, as we noted in the last lecture, perhaps more remarkable, the incidence of divorce has risen dramatically in the last 100 years, and the fertility rate has fallen dramatically. Although the internal organization of firms, not to mention the role of any individual firm within the market, has become more specialized, right? Firms produce more specialized products, and people in firms have more specialized jobs. Those same things in the families have become less so. Firms have gotten more specialized, families less. So how do we understand that? What we need to understand that is the Austrian theory of capital that we talked about in the first lecture, in the Piketty lecture. Rather than repeat all that, I'll just remind you all, right, that the idea of capital is, again, these inputs, these unfinished plans. Entrepreneurs have subjective expectations about how to fit those capital goods together. Capital goods can't be used for anything, more than one, less than infinity. All right? And changing capital goods, retraining human beings or refitting a capital good is not costless, right? That requires investment. The capital of the firm is complementary across the whole economy. Substitution is the key. And when plans fail, we have to rethink our use of capital. When we think about human capital, though, we can add some things to that. Each individual is a producer of what we might call a structure of human capital that includes all the various skills, knowledge, education, experience, and the like that each person has acquired over a lifetime. The choices you make as individuals about the skills and knowledge you acquire, and any attempt, those will differ, right? Each of you will have different skills. And any attempt at an integrated production plan that includes human actors will have to take account of the heterogeneity, the differences in human capital. Human actors will have to consider the gains and losses of the particular human capital investments they make, because you face the same sort of uncertainty there as faced by market entrepreneurs who are attempting to invest physical capital. Looked at from this perspective, a marriage, and by implication a family, is an attempt to create an integrated structure of human capital within a household that's consistent with the plan the couple has to engage in market and household production that's necessary to sustain the household. That is, when people get married, right, you want two people whose human capital is compatible in a way that enables them to take care of work and to take care of the household in the ways they prefer. The plan that people have when they get married, however, can either succeed over time or fail, just like in a firm. So in this sense, divorce can be seen as evidence of plan failure. It's like a firm making losses, right? Plan failure is linked to the reliability of expectations, which in turn is related to the degree of uncertainty that producers face. So for example, in an environment of faster change, there may be more uncertainty and more plan failure. Entrepreneurs all the time try to respond to the increased number of failed plans by hedging against uncertainty. Right? Perhaps what entrepreneurs do is to use capital that's more versatile, that can be used in more different ways. So if they're wrong, they can more easily switch to something different. Right? Entrepreneurs might respond by shortening their planning horizons. Right? You can think about an entrepreneur in the market faced with uncertainty, doesn't want to plan for 3 years, only wants to plan for 1. Okay? They often will do that if they believe that uncertainty increases with the length of their planning horizon. If uncertainty is great, we would expect these sorts of adaptations to take place and see evidence of them manifested in a variety of outcomes in the marketplace. We might see changes in social institutions that enable actors to coordinate their behavior better when uncertainty is greater or when the uncertainty is of a different sort. What I will argue in a bit is that some of the ongoing demographic changes surrounding marriage and the family can be interpreted as reflecting similar rational responses to heightened uncertainty in the social world. But to understand all this, we need to talk a little bit about human capital some more in the market and household. Thus, my one slide. Okay? Within marriage, the most important but not the only dimension along which human capital can vary is the distinction between market-oriented and household-oriented human capital. Market-oriented human capital may be firm-specific or it can be more general in nature, but that kind of human capital is what's useful in the labor market more so than the household. So the kinds of human capital you invest to get a job and to work, those human capital investments are market human capital investments. By contrast, household-oriented human capital is primarily about household production. The most obvious and important type of household human capital are the skills associated with childcare, right? Taking care of kids. But it also might include skills for house cleaning, gardening, laundry, carpooling, cooking, barbecuing for men anyway, and the like. All right? Since human capital accumulation takes time and effort, and thus has an opportunity cost, if you specialize in household production, right, you're also specializing in the accumulation of specific kinds of human capital. And given that the household as a production unit requires inputs in the form of market-earned income combined with household human capital, right? That's what a household is, right? Market-earned income plus household human capital. Right? Most of human history has seen household members specialize in one or the other. Generally men in the labor market and women in the household, the most historically common. This pattern of specialization may follow actual or perceived comparative advantages. For example, when it's believed that women have a comparative advantage in childcare, we see women picking up those skills. And small initial differences in comparative advantage may, through the accumulation of specific human capital, become magnified over time. Because a lot of human capital accumulation is about increasing returns. The more you do something, the better you get at it. Right? In addition, some human capital is also marriage specific, in that it has more value inside a particular marriage than outside of it. That is, human capital may be more specialized to a particular household, relationship, or marriage specific, or it could be more generally applicable, and that's what you see up here. Right? Think about if you're in a relationship, think about the skills and knowledge you have of your partner that are unique to that person, that would not transfer very well if you were married or in a relationship with someone else. Right? That's specific household or relationship human capital. Getting to know your kids. Have you ever had the experience of raising kids and then having to, let's say you get divorced and remarried and raise different kids? It requires a whole different set of human capital because those kids are different, right? There's kid-specific human capital. So the human capital investment decision that people make is influenced by family members' expectation of the duration of the marriage. Right? Remember we said before, right? How long you think things will last and what your time horizon is may affect your decisions about how you invest in human capital. A marriage of unexpectedly shortened duration because of early death of either spouse or an increased likelihood of divorce as the marriage unfolds implies a shortened payoff period and increases the danger of what we might call a human capital loss from the accumulation of household human capital and especially marriage-specific human capital. Suppose you spend a lot of time investing in household or marriage-specific human capital with this person, and then the person dies or you get divorced. Right? All the time you spent now engaged in that is unrecoverable. That's a capital loss. Right? You can't get that back. So anything that engenders the expectation of a higher probability of marital dissolution, death or divorce, is likely to inhibit the accumulation of household human capital, specific household human capital in particular. So if people think divorce is more likely, they're perhaps less likely to accumulate household human capital because the value, the period of payoff, won't be as great, right? Because the gains from specializing are less, and if you think marriages will last less long, the incentive to sort of develop those household skills are less. That might explain, by the way, why both men and women are investing less time in household production. There's also a self-reinforcing process at work here. Right? As we saw in the last lecture, women's workforce participation has increased dramatically in the last half century or century. At the same time, the gains from marriage that are achieved by that specialization have fallen. With lower potential gains from marriage, both husbands and wives tend to reduce their marriage-specific investments in human capital. Right? So you don't have to invest as much in the things that are particular to your relationship because the gains from being married in the first place aren't as great. Okay? That lowers the cost of divorce, right? Follow this? If you invest less in household human capital, if you get divorced, your losses are less because you haven't invested as much time in those particular skills. Okay? Because if you have marriage-specific human capital, it's useless after divorce. You don't have to deal with this person anymore, so those skills you developed in dealing with them don't have any value. All right? Precisely because it's too specific. Okay? The lower cost of divorce therefore increases the incidence of divorce. Right? If divorce is easier, more people get divorced. And a rising divorce rate means people think divorce is more likely. And if they think divorce is more likely, they invest less in their household human capital. Right? So it's self-reinforcing. Right? And the less you invest in your human capital, that reduces the cost of divorce more. You invest less in human capital. Right? There's a self-reinforcing process here. One of the interesting things about this process is that divorce is actually most likely to occur early in a marriage. And given that, at least in general, custody of any children is most likely to be awarded to the wife, an increased probability of divorce is likely to increase the bargaining power of the husband and weaken that of the wife with respect to the allocation of household tasks and investment in household human capital. All right? And let me explain it. So listen to what that's saying, right? If divorce is more likely, and it's more likely that women will get the kids, what that does is it reduces the incentive of the husband to invest in household human capital. Because he's not like, if there's a divorce, he's not likely to get the kids. Who's got what kind of human capital, and how that human capital is going to play out after divorce. Married men, by the way, face similar calculations. If married women are expected to get the children in divorce settlement, right, then the loss from a divorce is likely to be greater for them than for their husbands, right? Because women have to both care for the kids and earn income. Now, this ignores the fact that the loss to husbands who really want custody but don't get it, which, again, that could be significant, all right? Though those cases are not, are fairly rare, all right? So in general, husbands gain when wives take on the majority of the child care. Given the way custody usually goes, that is to women, men are unlikely to plan for having to engage in any significant increase in child-related household production after divorce, whatever their feelings about custody. So given the labor market participation rates of women, a rising divorce rate works to reduce the amount of household human capital that husbands accumulate. That is, if men think there's likely to be a divorce and their wives will you're going to get the kids, what incentive do men have to learn how to take care of the kids? Right? They don't have to invest in that any more than they already were. In an earlier era, right, when household division of labor was more specialized, there was then little incentive for men to acquire household human capital. Why? It wasn't their job. With the decline in specialization, men have, as we pointed out in the other lecture, indeed acquired more than they used to. That is, men are doing around the house more work around the house than they used to. But as we've suggested, right, it hasn't equalized. And why hasn't it equalized, even though men's and women's wages have become more equal? It might well be because men know that they don't have to acquire that household human capital because they have the better bargaining power in the case of divorce. All right? And that is an interesting question to think about. So why have we seen this increase in divorce that skews these decisions that people make about household human capital? Right? And here's where the Austrian emphasis on uncertainty and plan failure can come into play. So let's think this through. Again, this is going to be equally dense and complicated here, but bear with me. The rise in women's wages and the increase in women's labor force participation, the decline in fertility, that is the number of kids, and the decline in the cost of divorce, all combine and interact to explain a lot of the changes that we've seen in the structure of marriage and family over the last 4 decades. But there's one other factor at work, which is the level of uncertainty produced by the rapid social and economic changes that have taken place over this period. Certainly, at least since the 1970s, there have been far-reaching and fundamental changes that have affected the workplace for both men and women, and that have implied a loss of certainty with regard to lifetime careers that may not surprisingly have affected the ability to plan family life as well. So for example, the fact that it's harder to predict exactly how a potential marital partner's life and work is going to play out. Is she going to stay at home? Is she going to work? It's more complicated than it used to be. Creates additional uncertainty that affects decisions to marry. Right? So if we think about divorce for a second, divorce can occur in two different kinds of circumstances. One, it turns out the benefits from marriage are lower than people expected, such that the net benefits of continuing the marriage are negative. You thought you were going to live happily ever after. Turns out you're living miserably ever after, right? And you decide to get divorced, okay? A second possibility, and we don't think about this one as much, is that the benefits from marriage, though they turn out as expected, become exhausted. That is, there's no more benefits left, right? Think of this like a firm going out of business, right? Not because it was making losses, just because you never expected it to last more than 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. So that the marginal net benefits of continuing the marriage are negative. So you can have a case where people expected to be happy and were unhappy, or a case where people got married, again, expecting for it to just last for a certain period of time, and it did, and they're done. We don't think about marriages like the second case, but at least that's conceivable, right? That something like that might happen. The second case, though, it's hard to argue that that's a planned failure. It seems like people planned for it to end after a certain period of time. It wasn't a failure, right? As average lifespans grow, we might not be surprised to see more of this sort of thing happening, of marriages exhausting themselves, right? Given that marriage as being centrally about romantic love took hold in the 18th and 19th centuries, when life expectancies at the age of marriage were shorter than today, it may well be the case that the institution of marriage today is incompatible with death do us part, when marriages will go on for 50 or 60 or 70 years. Right? This point's even more telling when we look at the evolutionary long run and recall that for the vast majority of our biological history, human lifespans were even shorter than in the 18th and 19th century. There might be evolutionary reasons why 50 or 60 years of pair bonding marriage is difficult to achieve. If sustaining, especially by the way, when we expect marriages to be about love, if sustaining the intensity of the marital relationship beyond a certain number of years becomes increasingly difficult, right? We would expect to see more divorces later in life, as couples simply say, again, I don't mean this in a negative way. Simply say, I'm tired of you, right? I've changed, I'm different. We've exhausted the benefits from our marriage. And by the way, there's some evidence to support this expectation. There are an increase in divorces later in life over the last decade or two. Now, if it's for this reason, it's not clear. So longer lifespans might also contribute to delayed entrance in marriage. That is, one way to avoid being alone or miserable at the end of your life is not trying to get married at 25 and make a marriage last for 70 years, but getting married later in life so that you can make it last until your old age, right? Given any reasonable discount rate, which is good economics for you, a willingness to give up current marital benefits for ones in the distant future suggests that the net benefits of marriage at a young age are quite low, and the benefits of marriage at the end of life are quite high. And that seems compatible with the kind of arguments we're making here, right? And the latter, the idea of marriage being beneficial later in life, seems intuitively plausible, as the companionship and joint resources of marriage will become more important when people retire from market production and return to the home and potentially face illnesses and rising medical costs towards the end of life. Those are the times you want a partner, right? To enjoy your retirement, to help someone take care of you. What we might also see, and here's some speculation for you, is the rise of serial marriages. It's conceivable that divorce could be planned, like short-term ventures in business. It could be that with the declining benefits from marriage, people plan shorter marriages. This is not, this is consistent with some things we see in the marriage market. If there is an upper time limit on the sustainability of marriages, that is, they really can only last so long, we might well begin to incorporate that into our plans, leading to more marriages, but of shorter lengths, which would also mean more divorce. Right, so imagine someone marrying one person to have children with them, and then deciding, no, now I want a different person to spend the next part of my life with, and maybe a different person when I'm in my old age. Okay, that's a radically different way of thinking about marriage. All right? Notice, though, if we go to something like this, if people do things like this, that the expectation of engaging in serial marriages would imply a much lower payoff for investments in relation-specific human capital. And that would increase the likelihood of divorce and the prevalence of multiple short-term marriages. Again, reinforcing, if you think your marriage is going to only last for a short period, you don't make the investments you need to make it last for a long period, right? So it lasts for a short period, and it confirms your stuff. In terms of Austrian capital theory, serial marriages would mean less investment in specific forms of human capital, which in turn reduces the fineness of how complementary those household production plans are. It's like having a machine that's not very specialized, and so you can't be quite as productive with that machine as you would be if it were more specialized. And that creates a less well-integrated combination of human capital in the household. That reduces the marriage's productivity, right? And that increases the likelihood of divorce. The more general human capital is in the household, all the things equal, the less productive it is and the less likely that marriage is to survive. Although in these sorts of cases, it may not be a very surprising event for the husband and wife, divorce is nevertheless surely an instance of planned failure in the eyes of non-adult children of the divorcing family. Even if it's often the case, it may be preferable to the continuation of a bad marriage. Whatever the plan, it's hard to argue that in general, divorce is the best case scenario for all the parties involved. So even if we think about these things this way in terms of the probability of divorce, right, that although divorce in general has a substantially higher probability than before, it's still not expected. Specific divorces are never fully expected, and therefore still, relative to the best possible outcome, a successful continuing marriage, an instance of planned failure. Either way, then, conditions that may have conspired to make the social environment more uncertain are things that will make divorce more likely and create these kinds of issues. So what are the kinds of things that may have made the environment more uncertain? One might be no-fault divorce, right? If you know about no-fault divorce, right? People can leave a marriage for any reason. It doesn't have to be because someone did something wrong. Okay. One of the things people talk about, one of the sources of uncertainty people talk about, is that since World War II, the variation in female work patterns have become greater and more difficult for potential mates to predict. So more marriages occurred where there were mistakes in partner selection were made. What do we mean by that? Men found it more difficult to predict the wife's working pattern, right? And that implied a related difficulty of predicting how well integrated the human capital of the married couple would be, and therefore how productive the marriage would be. In other words, during the 1970s, it became more difficult for men to know exactly what a given woman's contribution to market and household production would be, given the fluctuation in gender roles and the opportunities that were taking place and continue today. So that uncertainty about being able to predict your future mate's work and household plans made marriages less productive, less efficient. Like, this is a huge transaction cost reducer. And so you can understand these, again, as these sort of new institutions. These dating sites are perfect examples of the bottom-up emergence of transaction cost reducing institutions that enable us to enhance social coordination in response to increased uncertainty. That is, they're just like all the other internet applications you can think of, right? That help us match, bring people up to get eBay, right? eBay's a huge transaction cost reducer. It makes it much easier to find trading partners than it used to be the case. So in this regard, eHarmony and Match.com might be contributing to the more recent decline in the divorce rate, right? As divorce rates are coming down, it might be that these institutions are helping people form better marriages by helping them more accurately get matched up with someone whose human capital is complementary to their own. It's hard to think of what the analogy for this would be in the world of sort of regular market production, right? It would be as if you could submit your business plan to a website, and they would look at your business plan and say, well, here's the machinery you should buy, and here's the people you should hire to execute that plan, right? Now, if you're an entrepreneur and someone had a website that could do that for you, that would be awesome, right? Because what do you do now? You take your best guess. You go, all right, I think this is the machinery I need. I think these are the people I need. I think I got a plan here. But imagine submitting that information to someone else who could somehow calculate, it's hard to imagine what that would look like. And by the way, if they could calculate that, wouldn't they just do it themselves, right? Why would you give them all your information? You're just giving them your business plan. But it's sort of like that, right? That is, what those dating sites are like is providing the information to help you understand, right, to cut through that noise and figure out which signals are real. From this perspective, right, it's entirely possible and maybe even plausible that the notable changes in the family that we've seen in the last decades may be the manifestation of society in a short-term transition, a disequilibrium situation. As the economy of the United States and other places have recently gone through, the financial crisis and recession, those changes are still happening, of course. And those are part of a longer-term restructuring during which the nature of work and the workplace has changed radically. The advent of the information-based economy has transformed the career track. It's changed the relationship between workers and employers and rendered a lot of people's human capital obsolete. It's upset the typical expectations people have that are central to social coordination, right? So the things we thought were true about the nature of work and family aren't as true anymore, right? And as a result, it's rendered sort of traditional social wisdom somewhat obsolete. In a society in this sort of economic and social transition, it becomes harder to accurately predict the behavior of others with respect to work and family and gender roles. And that makes plan failure more likely. The fact that marriage rates are declining and that marriages are taking place at a later first age might be responses to both the lower benefits of marriage early in life and the greater variance about that associated with the uncertainty around these cultural and economic transitions. That is, maybe people are holding off on getting married because of this uncertainty, because they want more time to figure out who they are, figure out what potential partners are like, and that's why we see people engaging in later and fewer marriages. The divorce rate, change in the divorce rate, the higher divorce rate of the last 30 years may be a response to some of the same factors. Now, if we're getting to the point, right, where these signals are now starting to become perhaps less noisy, right, we know that the divorce rate has fallen somewhat since the 1990s. And maybe that social signaling process is becoming less noisy. As young people, particularly men, increasingly shed assumptions about work and marriage and family that characterized prior generations, and as marriage itself transitions away from production issues to consumption ones. It may be the case that the uncertainty that characterized the last 30 years, particularly around women's roles, is slowly diminishing. And so the empirical data suggesting that recent marriages have a slightly lower divorce rate, that recent marriages are fewer but better, okay, is consistent with this idea that uncertainty is falling and that people are finding ways of dealing with it. That is, the signals are getting less noisy. From an Austrian perspective, all of these things can be seen as endogenous institutional responses that are forms of equilibrating economic and social entrepreneurship. That is, anything that helps people better figure out what their potential marriage partners might be like are kind of forms of entrepreneurship that lead to equilibrium, the way that Austrians talk about these issues. So the Austrian theory of capital helps us make sense out of human capital, which in turn gives us some new insights on marriage and divorce. The heterogeneity and specificity of capital and of human capital, and the importance of the complementarity of plans, let us understand marriage as a human capital combination, and divorce in some sense as a plan failure that requires us to make changes to our human capital. It also helps us understand the incentives facing people before they get married and before they get divorced. As signals get noisier, as people think about the possibility of divorce, as people, therefore people think carefully about the human capital investments that they make, right? That explains a lot of the things, the sort of empirical evidence we may be observing. It helps us understand perhaps why marriage is being delayed and why divorce rates rose and now are perhaps leveling off. For Austrians, decision-making is always decision-making under uncertainty. And the more uncertainty people face, the more their decisions are going to be sort of conservative and careful ones that try to avoid losses from unexpected outcomes. And so what we might be seeing happen again in these marriage markets is people responding by responding in just these sorts of ways. And all of these insights, I think, are ones that are better and more fully understood when we bring an Austrian perspective to them. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.